It is Sunday, March 23rd, and it's getting pretty late with Jake Landau. This week, we have a new guest. He is a former NDP staffer, a former consultant, and a current strategist. His name is George Soule. George, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and I know that we called you in last minute, so thank you so much for being able to make it in. It is very good to have you on today.
Happy to be here.
So I think where we should probably start is just tell us a bit more about your work as a former NDP staffer. I know you recently managed, I believe, Jennifer French's campaign for the Ontario NDP, and I forget the specific riding. I apologize.
No, that's right. That in Oshawa. So yeah, my last thing. I started out in organizing a very, very long time ago and got sucked into communications, but it was nice to kind of get back down to my roots.
I can empathize. I started in organizing too, and once they figured out I knew how to code, they were like, "You're going in the database mines for the rest of your life."
Well, I'm jealous of those concrete skills.
Well, I was the only person on the last federal election I know who got to stay indoors most of the time, which is a big accomplishment.
There are bonuses for sure.
True. But although I do think it's important, especially for staff in those senior roles, to get out and actually knock on doors to make sure you know what volunteers are actually putting into your system.
No, I completely agree. And I have spent time on the doors whenever I can, because you're exactly right. It's one thing to sit in a boardroom in Ottawa and come up with the best lines, but if you're not connecting with people or you're not hearing what people have to say, then you're talking to the wrong folks.
Exactly.
To be honest, and that's changed even more and more. There was a time when, at very least, you probably were saying what the journalists in the Ottawa bubble agreed with or could understand. So your message was getting diffused that way. But now, we're sitting here on your podcast. I myself have a Substack or a blog. News is getting to folks.
New media is very democratized.
That's right. Yeah.
And I do appreciate it in a way. Obviously, there are some concerns when any random alt-right group can just spin up a website that looks reputable enough and then bot the likes on a Facebook group, and suddenly fake news is being spread. But on the other hand, it's also good that there isn't a gatekeeping mechanism to the field of journalism, because that's traditionally how news is also suppressed.
That's right. Yeah, there are definitely advantages. I get concerned sometimes about, how you can buy your way into, as you said, more influence. I get concerned about Elon Musk's ability to mess with algorithms to get the message out, and obviously, the owners of the other social media websites can do the same thing. So those things obviously there are concerns, but you're not wrong. At least now we don't have, 20 years ago there were basically two middle-aged white men who decided what the news of the day was, and whether you watch CTV or CBC, you get to find out what they thought.
And you had to essentially just pray that the owners of the Star would actually keep to Atkinson principles and that they weren't just an advertising slogan.
It certainly, yeah. Again, no system's been perfect, that's for sure.
Now, disclosure: I've been published in the Star. I liked working with my editors at the Star. Great time, great vibes. Just. we make jokes on this podcast, folks.
Yeah, no, and I want to be clear too. Some of my time as press secretary was some of my favorite work, and I really like people in the press gallery. So again, I do have kind of mixed feelings about where we're at. I think I have some faith that provided that Donald Trump doesn't blow the whole planet up, we will find a way through this to a good balance. But we are certainly in a transition mode.
Yeah, it is fun that every day I get to wake up like it's the Cold War, and I get to wonder whether our main geopolitical rival is going to erase our country from the map.
Yeah, no, man. Even a couple weeks ago, that would have been sort of a joke, but I'm not even sure if Donald Trump actually was serious the first time he said Canada should be the 51st state, but he's certainly serious now.
I felt almost like Cassandra from Greek myth, because I remember the day after the presidential election, I wrote column, and I believe I titled it like America or Trump has embraced fascism. And like I wrote like exactly that. I was worried that he was going to try and bust into our country, like because I had heard him talking about how he was like thinking about draining all the water like a faucet. And I'm like, well, we wouldn't agree to that, but I don't think he cares whether we agree. And unfortunately, I didn't seem to be very far off the mark.
Yeah, I think he thinks that maps are actually right. So gravity brings water from the north to the south, and the circumference of the planet very well. But yeah, I mean, and I think that you're seeing his influence now here. Like it turns everything we've ever thought mattered on its head when the actual question of our sovereignty is in question, right? Like the fact that we now have we have a prime minister who says he refuses to talk to the president of the United States until the president acknowledges that we are a sovereign state. That
was unthinkable like 10 years ago. Even in the first Donald Trump term, that was unthinkable.
Even like 10 weeks ago, to be honest, like it's Donald Trump was crazy, and you were prescient, so good for you. But I think for most of the people, even still, people use words like authoritarianism and fascism carefully because it feels we spent so much time staying away from things like that because they feel so extreme. But
right.
It's hard.
You don't want to like devalue the word by using it too much.
But yeah, exactly.
At this point, though, it does feel like it might be more that people are afraid to admit that it's happening, that the post-war or the rules-based international order or liberal international order, depending on how skeptical you are, is essentially collapsed.
Well, or is collapsing for sure, right? Like this whole idea, and that we like to admit it or not, that America was the world's peacekeeper, and we all kind of operated with that understanding that like NATO members don't hit each other, that kind of stuff. We no longer colonize.
To be fair, both Greece and Turkey are members of NATO, so I was never too 100% on the NATO members don't hit each other thing.
Fair enough. But
I get your point. Most NATO members do not hit each other.
Yeah, and I'm a multi-generational Canadian, so my family has never had to live this stuff closely, and I know there are folks from places, like Turkey or other countries in the Middle East that it's not completely out of the realm of their experience to have a neighboring country think that they shouldn't exist. But yeah, having America start to question that, not only here, but obviously, Greenland certainly, but also, Donald Trump's position in the Middle East and elsewhere, the whole planet. We don't really know what's going to happen next.
Right. I mean, obviously, both Democrats and Republicans alike in the White House haven't been particularly even-handed when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but it's sort of another world entirely when he's talking about ethnically cleansing it to build a resort.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Like it's hard. It is by definition ethnic cleansing is what he's talking about.
Right. And one person discussed this with me, and they talked about how even the word ethnic cleansing kind of originated during the Serbian genocide, kind of as a way to massage it into something more PR acceptable, a more PR acceptable way of killing slews of people based on their ethnicity. And I guess I still use the term because I don't think that necessarily worked for Milosevic. I think people mostly see the word ethnic cleansing as something abominable. So, but I do see how it can sort of blur the line on that regard. And you do have to wonder why in Canada we hew so close to the American line if America doesn't respect our sovereignty anymore either.
No, I completely agree.
But obviously, we'll have a lot of time to talk about defense and the new relationship and one of our three headline topics in the second half. I think what a lot of people might be interested in is to talk a bit more about your time when you were working for the federal NDP on Parliament Hill and what it was like working with the press gallery and honestly what your real highlights were from that experience.
Right. Yeah. So I started off initially in the student movement. It was a different time for that movement as well back then. And then from there, kind of bounced around a little bit. Ironically said I was never going to be involved in politics and work construction for a little while, but then I got sucked into a local campaign in Sudbury as a volunteer. And then not long after that, joined Jack Layton's office in February of 2009 as a regional media officer. So I did kind of our non-incumbent ridings, of which there were many, and kind of focused on talk radio as much as I could back then. And then kind of slowly moved up to national press secretary and then kind of a senior press secretary and talk about highlights. Like increasingly now it just dates me. But I was really lucky that Jack liked having me around. So I got to travel a lot with Jack Layton and see the impact that he was having on communities and also just his genuine passion for the work. And so, yeah, I feel very fortunate that I got to spend that time traveling. And then, going into 2011, it's one of the things that comes up a lot these days is a reminder that Jack Layton wasn't Jack Layton until after May 2nd, 2011, like the election day in 2011. That we hit into the low teens just 3.5 weeks before election day in 2011. So 3.5 weeks before we won 103 seats, we were at about 13% in some of the polls. And so that election campaign, I often say, like, one of the worst elections I've ever worked was the first 2 weeks of that campaign because it was just, we were getting beat up, but we were able to turn it around. And so that was exciting to kind of see that movement and see people decide that Michael Ignatieff wasn't their guy. So they saw Jack and he became their guy. So that was a highlight. After that, I spent some time as the executive assistant to the interim leader, Nicole Turmel. So again, I got to see the country and see kind of the world through a different perspective. And then got back into press secretary work. Obviously, 2015 had sort of a surprise ending in the opposite direction than the 2011 federal election did. And then I went to what I think was my favorite job I've ever had, which was chief of staff to a small but mighty opposition in Saskatchewan. There was kind of a bit of a sense of defeat right back there. Back then, they were fighting Brad Wall and kind of felt like there was nothing that could be done. People were working hard and definitely digging in, but it looked like Brad Wall was unbeatable. And I was just able to work with those folks and kind of slowly start turning the ship around a bit and take some different angles. And to be honest, it wasn't, I think often as is often the case, it's not like I was a genius. I just took what I knew, which became kind of new strategies in Saskatchewan. And we were able to really get some really big pushbacks against Brad Wall and really kind of get his back up against, I was going to say Wall, I don't want to say that.
We like puns here.
Yeah.
The worse, the better.
Brad Wall dipped below 50% in popularity, which sounds pretty good to just about any premier, but for him, that was a new low. 2 quarters in a row, and then he announced he was quitting.
And in a province that's mainly a two-party system, being below 50%, right. Like there isn't really minority governments. You win or you lose.
That's right. Now, like, the Liberal Party runs every time, but they haven't won a seat in a couple decades. There's an extreme right-wing party that only had a seat in the last legislature because somebody crossed the floor.
We've had that in Ontario too. I think we actually had 2 of them, and
that's right.
And enough of them did okay that they got the per vote subsidy. So good for the grifters.
But yeah, and then there was a couple leadership races. So we got a new premier, and then we also had a new leader of our party, and for a while, kind of for personal reasons and a couple of things going on, it just became the time was right for me to move on. And so I got to go work as the director of digital strategy for Premier Rachel Notley. And that was a lot of fun because it actually gave me some government experience. And also I was able to build a team. I didn't have a lot of experience, to be honest, in digital. And it's weird to think about how in 2018 2018, only 7 years ago, how different the world was. But, Rachel Notley didn't have a team kind of focused on digital communications back then.
I know that
so
the Ontario NDP digital work recently has been of note to the rest of the party, just because I know at one point I think they were performing better than the federal party's accounts.
that doesn't surprise me.
Yep.
And when, in 2018, like Rachel Notley was the least engaged, like she had the lowest level of engagement of any premier in the country. And, we were able to, the whole team got behind it, as did the premier. And, I was able to help play a role in helping to build that team that brought her to be the premier with the most amount of engagement in the country. So that was a cool experience, both in the digital level to kind of learn that part of the world in comms, which now, as we were saying, kind of dominates. And also to get some government experience, so that my whole experience wasn't just in opposition.
Right, and that's not particularly an NDP thing, but like in general, when your party doesn't get to form government a lot of the time, it is fun to actually get experience in government, and then when you find the next one in another province or federally, you have more knowledge on how to hit the ground running and make the most of your 4 years or your minority term.
Well, for sure, and it also helps frankly, with a different perspective in opposition as well, right? You get a sense of what, what they're going through, which obviously builds a little bit of sympathy, but it also allows you to kind of get a better sense of, the machinery.
And it's admittedly a harder job to do the things than to criticize the people doing the things.
That is right. You have a bigger platform, which was like that part was. We always knew that was true, but it's just amazing, right? You just announce, "Hey, we're having a press conference," and the whole gallery shows up because it's the premier.
Right. Yeah.
So that part was, you always knew that was the thing that we were missing, but it was cool to see, be able to benefit from it for a while. And then again, for personal reasons, I moved back to Ottawa. I thought I was going to manage a local campaign, but a couple things kind of shifted, and I got asked if I could help out in the federal, like the central campaign. So I did that. And to be honest, like, especially working at West, I initially wasn't a huge Jagmeet Singh supporter. Like, I wasn't ripping up my membership or anything, but I wasn't a huge supporter of his leadership. And in that campaign, the time I got to work with him, he won me over. I saw the commitment that he actually had. I saw the passion again. His level of authenticity, it's almost unbelievable, but to say, like, the guy that you see in front of the cameras is exactly the same guy. When you're sitting in a taxi at 2 a.m. on the way to a hotel after you've flown somewhere with him. I mean, he's just.
Oh, I've met him. Like, I've seen him like at the Pride Parade one year, and he was just riding on his bicycle, and a few Liberal staffers stopped and took a photo with him. He does have his appeal, and I understand why a lot of people definitely feel a sense of loyalty to him. What was it like working in his office, especially during the confidence and supply agreement?
So I left before that part.
Ooh.
But no, that's okay. Yeah. But it was still a minority government, obviously, and so we were doing it the old way. Yeah. Which is always funny when journalists complain about, the confidence and supply agreement, it means you've sold out. When you're doing vote by vote, they're all like, well, you should have an agreement because this is stupid. You can't win. But yeah, so we spent a lot of time working together and negotiating with the government of the day and the opposition parties and trying to get through each vote and figure out what we could get out of them each time. And that's, to show the benefit of this confidence supply agreement. Like, at that point, we were trying to pitch different ways that we could start pharmacare and dental care, and both behind closed doors and
pitch it to people who had already promised to do it, but you still had to flex their arm into actually doing the thing they promised to do.
Oh yeah, and I'm
a liberal, but like, I'll fully admit, we
literally laughed at Jagmeet's question about it. Like, if you go back, you can find clips where he literally laughs at Jagmeet asking about dental care, saying that's not a federal responsibility.
And there's a certain arrogance, and as a liberal, I'll fully admit this, and I hate this in my own party. There's a certain sense of, if the NDP aren't competitive enough to threaten us, then we won't really try that hard.
Well, I mean, yeah, to be more fair than I usually am to your party, because you wish went the other way. The Liberals, by nature, it's a criticism I have, but it's also why you've governed most of the time. Can kind of go either direction, but it also so you can swing with kind of the prevailing
They're
mood.
ideologically flexible at the cost of having basic core principles that tell you what they believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it means you win more elections, but it also means you have to look at both flanks, right? So,
and I guess I'm unusual as a liberal because my perspective is I don't just want to win an election. I want to win an election to do good things. If the only way you think we can win an election is to act like conservatives and do conservative things, then what's the point? Why wouldn't I just let the conservatives win? Like, why offer, like, are you really that more fond of the color red than blue?
Well, at the risk of insulting you, I'll say that that's exactly why I'm a New Democrat. I often say that I'm.
Oh, no insult taken. I get a lot of questions over why I'm still a liberal, and it's a pretty fair one. And at a certain point, I do to some extent. I like electability because at a certain point, it is frustrating to watch the federal NDP struggle to get their message accepted by a large segment of the population. I would like to see progressivism be doing well in this country, and I'm not particularly picky about which party does it. But there has been a perception, from my perspective, a lot of the time I tell people I wouldn't really go NDP because I don't think they're left enough to be sufficiently distinct yet.
Well, fair enough. And I think, some of that comes from more recent experiences too. I will concede that it definitely in messaging and even to some extent in legislation, Justin Trudeau brought the party more progressive. I often talk about how I was a Dalton McGuinty and Paul Martin New Democrat, which is to say that when I was cutting my teeth, going back to those student movement days in my late teens, early 20s, that's when Paul Martin was slashing and burning the budget. The deficit hawks can talk about why and justify that, and that's fine. But I saw the impact of those cuts to social programs and healthcare, and that's what motivated me to get involved.
Oh, I agree. When I was pretty young in the 2011 election, but it was the first one where I was politically conscious, where I was paying attention, where I really listened to what all the different candidates were saying. And I was enamored with Jack because, and I always tell people that if it weren't for losing Jack and if it weren't for, the weird centrist shift the NDP took under Mulcair and then the weird left pivot that Trudeau took the Liberals in, I very well could have grown up as a young dipper instead of a young liberal.
So many different things could have happened, right? I actually think if Jack stuck around, I don't know if we would have formed government, but I think the Liberals would have been less excited about Justin Trudeau leadership, maybe. There's just lots of things that could have been different. But certainly, that is, I think that's the kind of questions maybe we can look at and see what happens if Mark Carney is successful in this election. I think you'll see a much more Paul Martin-esque government.
And that really is the million-dollar question. Will Mark Carney be successful in the next election? We'll save that for after this break, folks, as our first of our free headline topics, so don't go anywhere. We will see you soon. Today's episode of It's Getting Pretty Late with Jake Landau is brought to you by me. You see, folks, while all of my written articles and podcasts are available without a paywall, I need money to make them. Also, I need money to live. So, if you enjoy my content or find it informative, please consider an optional paid subscription at jakelandau.ca/subscribe. Thank you, and enjoy the show. And we are back from the break with our guest, George Soule. George, great to have you here. Folks, today we have our three headline topics, and obviously the first one is the story that's on everybody's mind. The writ for a federal election has been dropped, or as Steve Paikin would say, drawn up, but I disagree with him on that one. I think language is fluid, so we're keeping it dropped. And we've had Mark Carney go and get dissolution from the Governor General. We've had the leaders of the Conservatives and the NDP and the Greens and the Bloc all speak. So, George, tell us your thoughts on what this race is looking like for you so far with everyone's first impression.
Well, I mean, I think, I'll say this thing that everyone has been saying, but it's still remarkable, even though we've been talking about it for the last couple of weeks, is that, about a month and a half ago, there was about a 3% chance that the Liberals could pull off a minority government. And now I think a minority Liberal government's what the pollsters are saying is the most likely outcome. So, obviously there's been a pretty big shift. That was always a possibility. I think when you bring in a new leader, now you're gonna have Mark Carney Canadians want change. He's gonna try to say he is the change. And obviously, as we were discussing, that Donald Trump and the threat to our sovereignty has changed what the priorities are for people and kind of how we view the role of our government.
Right. It's certainly like the left or right may play less of a role in this election versus national identity, patriotism, nationalism, and who can manifest that. And I know the Mark Carney put out an ad, I think yesterday, with Mike Myers. I was forgetting his name. I was remembering Shrek and SNL, but I forgot. But I forgot the actual dude's name. Mike Myers, and I know and it was very corny. Like, it was an extremely corny ad, and I think people will love it and eat it up.
Yeah, look, I think it was brilliant of them to do. Some people are going to quibble about whether it was properly financed and who should have done it and whatever. I think it was smart. And I also think it was interesting that Mike Myers at the end of an SNL gig happened to do the elbows up, which most of us Canadians who have either played hockey or been around hockey know exactly what that means.
Oh, I was a goon in the GTHL. I'm familiar with the principles of elbows up. It was my elbows.
Fair enough. No matter how, even as old as I've made myself appear to be in this podcast, I wasn't old enough to watch a whole lot of Gordie Howe playing, but my grandpa would talk a lot about, Gordie Howe going in and coming out of the corner, and his opponent was bloodied, but Gordie Howe looked innocent the whole time. So yeah, I mean, that is something that I think is palpable in Canadians. I think, patriotism is something that we, for most of our generation at least, we've been largely kind of uncomfortable with patriotism and what that looks like and exactly what it means. And,
the flag belonged to convoy protesters to a certain extent for a weird year, more than it did the actual people of Canada.
Well, yeah. So even beyond like our normal discomfort, you're right. Like over the last couple of years, if you saw a Canada flag flying, like basically because I was out west in 2019 and 2018. So like the yellow vesters, which kind of predated the convoy folk. The Canada flag became kind of the symbol of, frankly, some pretty angry people. So it's been cool to kind of see people recapturing our flag at least. And then even the patriotism is kind of fun, but it's also important because, again, we could very well be genuinely under threat of losing at least part of our country, either in the south or my biggest concern is around the Arctic. So yeah, I think that's what this election has become a lot about. I think you're going to see the Liberals, just because of by design. It's no coincidence that the Canadian flag that they pushed to embrace was the one that matched their party colors. By design, they are kind of seen as the party of the flag.
It was cheap, but sure did it work.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I'm not sure how much I'd like a national flag that was orange anyway. But
to be fair, look at all the blue flags for the city of Toronto. Those weren't very subtle either.
No, none of that is wrong.
Remember in the 1980s in the Big Blue Machine era where the government logo for the government of Ontario would actually just flip from blue to red based on which party was in government?
Well, and we saw Stephen Harper move, like the Conservative logo became very close to the Canadian Air Force logo, or vice versa. So, I mean, look, every party does that, but I will say that like the Liberals are going to embrace this idea of the party of the flag. You're going to see the Conservatives, trying to do this weird dance. Like I almost feel for them if I wasn't more concerned about what they do if they were in government.
Yeah, if there weren't some morally odious people there.
Well, yeah, sure. I think, they spent the last 3 years laying out a clear plan to win this election. And again, like 5 months ago or 6 months ago or whatever it is now, it looked like he was going to be able to do it in a walk. And now everything they had built that on, so Justin Trudeau and the carbon tax primarily, but also just Canada's broken and we need to fix it. It's out the window. They can't use any of it.
It took them too long to actually get enough opposition parties to. Well, no opposition party ever seemed willing to vote no confidence with them, and the result is that now the election is being called on the Liberals' terms at the time most advantageous to them.
Sure. I mean, there's lots of the debate, and we could talk. And if you want to talk about, we can talk about what might have happened had the NDP voted them down in the fall. Like, I would suggest that the NDP probably would have done pretty well, probably somewhere between 50 and 100 seats, 50 and 80 seats. But it would have been a massive conservative majority government.
Indeed. And there was, I remember in 2011, there were a lot of people who were like, why are the NDP celebrating? The Conservatives just want a majority. And I think that was a bit harsh. I think when you get to official opposition for the first time and displace the Liberals, you get the right to celebrate a little. But I also do understand the idea of not being happy when you've lost the ability to have political influence for 4 years.
It's a weird place to be in, because again, I was there. I was there in minority government when we had 37 seats, and we were doing it vote by vote, but felt like we could really influence the conversation, even though our polling was low and we had few seats. We could really influence, at least push the government around a little bit. And then once we won 103 seats, like, you could feel bigger, and it felt, we had all the pomp and circumstance of official opposition, but we had no real power.
Right.
So there is that balance there.
Big caucus budget, though.
Well, yeah, for sure. And one of the things that also would have happened had the NDP pulled the plug in the fall is that we wouldn't have dental care where we're at. We wouldn't have pharmacare where it's at. So part of it was trying to make sure that those things kind of got over the line and really entrenched, so that they would be harder to be removed. And now that millions of people have actually had their teeth checked out.
So from your perspective, at the cost of making it less likely that the NDP will do well in this election, they used their political capital to do good things that will help people.
It is true. I want to be clear. I'm a New Democrat who thinks it's better for us to win. And again, I've worked in government, and I would like to work in a federal government someday, or at least be governed by one that's a New Democrat government. But I think a fair reading of what's happened shows that the NDP put party aside, and Jagmeet in particular put party aside, and said not what's best for the NDP, but what's best for Canada, and said this healthcare and this pharmacare and this dental care program are so close, we can't pull the plug until we get them at least a little bit over the line. And that, I think that our country, and I hope generations, will benefit because of that decision, even if it means that this election is going to be a lot tougher than it could have been otherwise.
More than benefit, I hope that history will reevaluate the agreement and the idea of inter-party collaboration, especially in minority parliaments, because I am very I'm very concerned that the NDP are being punished, not because people don't like their ideas, but because people were upset at them for propping up the Liberals, but yet they're now also willing to vote for the Liberals. And I'm worried about a perverse incentive pushing parties away from collaborating with each other, from working with each other on important priorities. That wouldn't be healthy for our democracy.
Well, and to be honest, like, that's something, and I don't want to sit here and pout, but it's something the NDP's dealt with for a long time. I have a friend, I wasn't there, but a friend of mine was working a long time ago in a Toronto Centre by-election, and was calling for the NDP to some housing, and had person after person would answer the phone and say, no way, I'm not voting for NDP ever again. Bob Rae screwed us. I hate Bob Rae. I'm voting Liberal. Click.
And like, Bob Rae isn't even an NDPer anymore. Like, he left.
More than that, in that by-election, Bob Rae was the Liberal candidate. The NDP wore Bob Rae more than Bob Rae wore Bob Rae.
I forget about Bob Rae as a federal member of parliament. I think about him mostly as the ambassador to the United Nations nowadays.
Well, no, fair enough. And that, it's a job that I'm sure he's enjoying. But anyway, I think that, so go back to this election. I think that is, we'll see how that dance works. I think, and we'll see, but one, I think Jagmeet's looking really strong, but I also think that there is a role for, look, nobody, I think we're getting to a place where people understand it's no longer who can best negotiate with Donald Trump, because there's no negotiating with Donald Trump.
Like, what deal are you going to make that he'll then violate in a week anyways when he doesn't like that one either? It would be like telling Poland or Austria to make a deal with Hitler. Like, and I don't resent that. I'm not afraid to make that comparison. He literally is saying he wants to do an Anschluss.
So yeah, I mean, so I don't think the argument will stay long about who can negotiate better. It's about who can fight for our country. And, people don't always necessarily look at us that way, and certainly don't always look at Jagmeet that way. Hopefully this election can change. As I've said, I've worked in elections. I've gone both directions, from us being really high and falling quite low, and us being really low and winning official opposition. But so we'll see what happens. But I do think there's a role for the NDP that people trust us on, is that when the times get tough, they want somebody who will make sure that our healthcare doesn't, that the first thing the government does isn't slash our healthcare. That like employment insurance is there for them if they lose their jobs in a short-term way, and they want to make sure that their kids are taken care of if they, if they lose their jobs and if times get more tough than they already are. So I think there's a place for the NDP to really, have a strong argument during this campaign. So we'll see if they pull it off. But I do think that's kind of where those three parties now have kind of three different directions, and they're going to try to occupy some of the same space. Because to your point, left, right, and center in a lot of ways have merged over this whole conversation about let's make sure we just protect our country.
Right. And in a way, both the NDP and the Liberals, to various extents, have integrated some aspects of neoliberalism. The Liberals, I would say, more than the NDP, but the NDP aren't untainted by original sin. So you're right about the blending that we've both talked about. I guess my final question before we move on to our next topic is, there is one party that we have not mentioned, and they are a party that currently holds more seats than the NDP and is currently polling to potentially do so again, and that would be the Bloc Québécois, who, for those who live under a rock and aren't aware, only run in the province of Quebec. And that creates another unique consideration, especially for the debate about who will protect Canada, who will stand up for Canada. How do you see the Bloc factoring into seats in Quebec that the NDP might need to win?
So, I did live in Quebec for a few years. My mom was born there as well. I live there. I've lived and worked there. My daughter was born there. But I want to be very clear. I'm an Anglophone from Northern Ontario. So I don't want any Quebecers to be listening to this and think that I'm pretending to understand everything exactly, but I do know.
My family is from Dollar Dormo, and I promise you that you'll be judged most harshly for every word you say.
Fair enough. When I was a kid, my dad would go to the Quebec side to buy beer because it's cheaper. Up in Northern Ontario. Anyway, the point that I was trying to make, I think, is I do think that one, this whole idea of sovereignty and that word is very different now in the lexicon, I think, even of Quebecers than it has been for, again, generations. So I think there's a bit of a different dance for the Bloc to do as well. I mean, trashing Canada, even to I think in a lot of ways, it's sort of that your sibling, right? Like, right. You can. Like, I can make fun of my sister, but you can't make fun of my sister.
Right. And I saw some of this in how the François Blanchet was talking. He talked about how Canada can be an ally to Quebec. Obviously, the implication is that they aren't necessarily an ally currently, but it is a very different frame of reference from when the Bloc was the opposition in the 90s and there was the referendum.
That's right. Yeah, like this idea. Yeah, again, they might want to break up a little bit and have a different living arrangement with Canada, but they certainly want to work with Canada to make sure the United States doesn't take over us all.
And admittedly, it isn't impossible for Quebec to have a different relationship with the federal government. A lot of people aren't aware that the constitutional amending formula allows for amendments that only affect one or a small set of provinces, if just that province and the federal parliament agreed. So technically, the balance of powers between Quebec and the federal government could change the division of which government gets to do what, while it stayed the same for other provinces, if it made political sense for a future government to do so.
That's right. And, we could spend a long list of podcasts talking about the realities of Quebec. But I will say that it is a
10-hour constitutional monologue.
Well, that does that too. But it is a unique culture. It is I do believe it is a unique nation, and it is different than our other provinces are different from each other. It is a distinct society in one way or another. But again, I think that the Bloc's kind of ability to just lean in on, again, Canada's broken, we need to leave, it's been weakened. So they have a different argument to make. That's not to say that I think they're going to get wiped out, because I don't think that's the case. But I do think that it's a new challenge for them. And again, I think there's an opportunity. Well, it's difficult for all kinds of reasons for Jagmeet, different than it was for Jack, who grew up in Quebec. I think there's an opportunity, at least in some key areas, for the NDP to say, look, we understand how things are different. You've seen what happened when you had NDP MPs. Give us a try again.
And we guess we will see in the election on April 28th how things end up going. But it will be an interesting race for sure. Our next headline topic this week, folks, is about Canadian defense, Canadian military spending, and our relationship with Europe. Recently, Mark Carney visited Europe before dropping the writ for this election. And during that time, he announced that Canada would be deepening its defense relationship with the European Union, with Britain, and also there was an announcement of a partnership with Australia as well. And obviously, the big topic here is the F-35 procurement. And this will be the third time in my life we have a debate over whether or not we buy the Lockheed Martin F-35 fighter jet. I would hope that we could have figured it out the first few times, but obviously it's a little different now that we're considering the main enemy we might have to fight with them is the country that could sell them to us.
Oh, that's right. It is a whole new world, right? Like, in a lot of ways, we've always had to have a military that was big enough that we could combine that with the way that our soldiers are respected, and kind of just work along with the Americans.
Use our soft power to enhance the reputation of our hard power.
That's right. That's right. And now we're in a very different place. So you're not wrong. I also remember spending a whole lot of time debating the F-35s. In a couple different iterations, and it just seems like time is a flat circle in Ottawa sometimes. And
admittedly, I did support procurement of the F-35 in the last few times, as weird as it would be for me to even be thinking about that in the 2015 election as a minor. But it really is just the fact that, well, the F-35 needs frequent software updates from the United States every few weeks with updated telemetry, mission and the idea is without those regular software updates, the plane is a brick. It will not fly. The only F-35 model that is different I believe, is the Israeli procurement, and that is because Israel was able to leverage their relationship with the United States to become a special partner, different from the three tiers in the program, and as a result, they were able to completely substitute the electronic warfare system for their own indigenous one, so they would not have the same problems, and it is kind of embarrassing that they were able to pressure the U.S. into such a compromise, and we weren't.
Yeah, although, I think that Israel's always had a special relationship with the U.S.
True, but you would hope we would have a special relationship with the U.S.
Yeah.
We're
so
next door.
There was, I'll say this. So, a couple things. One, I think there was a bit of a typo that ended up going out the door. So some misunderstanding, I think, of the NDP's proposition at first, which was that we would somehow build F-35s here. It's not. It's a different kind of plane. The Swedes, through Saab, people know it's a car, but they also build planes, have the Gripen.
Right, and you want the idea is to build the Gripen E here, or
that's right.
At least to construct a large portion of it here.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And I agree. I like that proposal a great deal. I think the Gripen E, or that current iteration of the Gripen, is the best alternative. Although I know France has also proposed the Dassault Rafale. But I know the Gripen, well, it's designed by Sweden. It's designed for short takeoff and landing in winterized areas. It almost does feel like a pretty good fit for the Canadian use case.
No, that's right. Yeah. And so, again, Sweden understands our climate in a lot of ways more than the Americans do, frankly. So I think there's good work happening that could happen there to, again, and the other thing that would happen, a lot of that work to kind of gear up to be ready for that could be used in our attempt to get to 2% of our GDP for military
And
spending.
I laugh that we were only trying to get to 2% because the Americans kept bullying us into doing it. But I was like, well, we need it to protect against you.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think that's what's finally...
They kind of coaxed themselves into a snafu there, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, 100%. And then like another one that's kind of a bit of a head scratcher for the current government, or I guess the former government now, is the P-8 Poseidon. So these are like these planes that can take care of
the militarized version of the Boeing 737, I believe.
That's right. Yeah. And so they did the Liberals did a sole source contract with Boeing, but Bombardier wants in on that. And so I think that's another option. Kind of, sure, we'd have to figure out how to get out of that deal, but it was wrong to sign it in the first place. And at very least, there should be a bidding process where Canadian companies, I would argue, we just don't accept American
I know when
companies.
we talk about getting out of these deals or copyright implications, I don't think people understand. If we went to war with the United States, we're not worried about the copyright of American parts that might be in it. It's like, I know this was, someone mentioned this to me. They're like, oh, the problem with the Gripen E is that the engine is produced in Sweden under license from an American company. And I'm like, yeah, under license. If America invades Sweden, they're not going to stop making them. It's like, oh no, we don't have the copyright. The Berne Convention. No, it's war. Like a great example of this is I remember 2011, 2012-ish. Remember when the United States was flying the drone over Iran, and Iran managed to capture the drone, and then the United States was like, "That's not our drone," and Iran was like, "Nah, this is your drone." And then and then Obama had the audacity to be, "Could you please give us back our drone?" And Iran was like, "No." No, and they reverse engineered it, and they now have multiple models of drone that are made in Iran that are essentially an almost carbon copy, if not an exact copy. But it doesn't matter that it's a copy. What matters is they can produce them on their own soil, and they're very capable, and they make the people that Iran flies them towards afraid.
Yeah, and I'm afraid that someday we may be on that list.
Yeah, so. No, mind you, disclosure, folks, I do not support the Islamic Republic of Iran. I do not support the Ayatollah. I also do not support the Shah. I liked when Iran was a democracy. I don't think authoritarianism is good, secular or religious. Basic standpoint there. But it is good, I guess, to learn a bit from Iran's example, because they are a good example of how to develop your military when the entire world has you under sanction.
Yeah, and we could do it quickly. I mean, and just, before we move off this topic, I also say that, the 2%, again, I think we need to genuinely, if we want to maintain the country that we currently have, be concerned about the North. And I think there are lots of opportunities to support communities and people and infrastructure in the North, and still be able to get to that GDP, that 2% or 2.5% of GDP, while actually using a lot of that money to build up communities and community centers and schools and all kinds of things that would still fall under the same place. So I think there's lots of opportunity there that we shouldn't waste.
Valid. One more bit question before we go on to our final topic of the day. Do you think that Canada needs to develop a nuclear deterrent?
I am not a fan of nuclear proliferation, and I kind of feel like, how many times do we need to be able to blow up the planet? And not, so I don't want to oversimplify that and sound like the lefty hippie or anything, but I also think that at what point is it useful? I think a lot of questions are up in the air right now, because again, the biggest thing that defends us is NORAD, and that is in cooperation. I grew up in North Bay, Ontario, which is where, less and less, but still one of the main bases in our country used to be, and still we have Americans that live there on rotation all the time, from the base in Colorado. So yeah, I'm not a fan of nuclear proliferation, but I will say that we certainly need to figure out new ways to protect ourselves and be aware of how much things have changed when we have these conversations.
Very sobering conversation to have, indeed. Moving on to our final topic of the day. Many of you listening at home may be familiar with a small town on the border of Quebec and Vermont. On the Quebec side, the town is called Stanstead. And this town is notable because for over 100 years, there is a library and opera house, mostly library. I don't know how much they have live opera anymore, but that perfectly straddles the border of Canada and the United States. And how it has worked for an extremely long time under an unwritten agreement, essentially, is that the main door is on the American side, so Canadians can walk along the sidewalk to get in. Both Canadians and Americans can visit the library, and as long as they exit back to the country that they came in from, then Border Patrol will not concern themselves. Unfortunately, after Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security in the United States and admitted puppy murderer Kristi Noem jumped back and forth over the line, saying number one country, American US, number one, and then 51st state, U.S. Border Patrol has announced they will no longer be allowing Canadians to cross the border to enter the library through the main American door. There's apparently a back door on the Canadian side, so I think there's a bit of hyperbole in saying that Canadians won't be able to access it, but there will need to be some renovations done in order to make it accessible. But I guess the question I have for you, George, is there much point in making those renovations to a building that we're not sure will be able to exist much longer?
Well, look, it's interesting because I've been to that library. And we did some work, again, between 11 and 15 when we had so many members. That I spent some time in Stanstead and talked about trying to get better border security, because there's actually a relatively open border next to it where people, like, there's just a road that had one of those armed gates. I'm not sure what's there now, but like a decade ago, it was just one of those like wooden arms that goes down and comes up.
Yeah, you can just walk straight across. And
right.
From my understanding, like, people mainly didn't do it just because they knew that someone in Border Patrol would sigh and then have to get out of the office and go talk to them.
Well, on the outside of business hours, you basically had to like call another office and say, "Hey, I'm crossing the border."
So, like when you'd be crossing by boat.
Well, there's that too. Yeah, exactly. So, I think a lot of the stuff is going to be extreme. There are people's houses in parts of Quebec and New Brunswick that technically the border goes through. So it's going to be interesting to see. This library. You're right. There is actually a door to go in. I guess where the rest of the renovations would really have to be is if the Americans want to make an example of this, and I'm sure they do because it's ridiculous. Maybe a wall up through the middle of the library or something.
Would they even be allowed to share a physical wall, or would they say it has to be ripped down and two separate buildings built?
Well, exactly. Who knows? Different fire codes. Yeah. So there's some lore and mythology around it that Paul McCartney was dealing with a European drug charge. He wasn't allowed into the United States, so he met with John Lennon in that library. There's lots of talk about it, and lots of people tell that story. I've done some research about it, and then kind of dug up again when I saw this topic coming up today. It doesn't seem like anybody can find proof that it happened, but it's definitely, this library has been talked about for a long time for things like that.
That reminds me of when the University of Oregon for the longest time had Donald Duck as their mascot for college football. And after many decades, someone in the Disney company was like, wait a minute, do you have a license to do that? and they eventually had to like dredge up like an old photo of Walt Disney wearing a University of Oregon shirt with Donald Duck on it to prove that there had been a handshake deal. But that is kind of the problem with these handshake deals on international borders.
That's right.
Not that Donald Duck is very comparable.
Well, I mean, yes, yep. As long as Donald Trump keeps wearing pants, I guess we're one step up. But Who knows if that'll last forever? Anyway, my point being that I think this, this topic. It can kind of seem silly, but it is places like that. Like so, the houses and that library are, despite the War of 1812 and other times, and the fact that largely being Canadian is about not being American. That relationship that we have in the United States is important and is always basically almost always been very close. And to see that being torn apart now and threatened with a level of protectionism and isolationism and authoritarianism and many other isms, I guess, is shocking. And
it's terrifying.
Yeah, it really is. And again, like, sure, it's just a library, but this is something like this is like an historical, symbol of that relationship that we have.
Right. And I hate when people say like, oh, it's just a library. Well, like the things that we build for our communities are an important symbol of what our communities value, what we think are important for our society to have. So I agree with you, like on the symbolism, like the fact that for over 100 years it has stood, and the idea is that Canadians and Americans can walk in there and the passport, the flag do not matter. They are one community and they are one people. That was a heartwarming thing, and now you almost feel afraid to mention that it was that way out of the fear that you could be perceived as not being pro-Canada enough.
Well, yeah, or and like it's scary to go to the States now, right?
Yeah, I was in New York last summer for the Copa America semifinals when Canada was playing Argentina, and I got to see Lionel Messi, and we were cheating, but nobody had found out yet, and I'm glad they hadn't found out yet, because I would not have, the Messi fans would not have let me leave alive if they found that out during the game. But it's like, there was so much stuff in New York that I was just like, oh, I'm just here for the weekend, I'm going to be back soon, I've got an Nexus card, I come here all the time. And now I don't know when it isn't just that we're worried for a few months. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to cross that border normally again in my lifetime.
Well, that's right. And I think for a lot of us who didn't grow up near the border, you can understand that in one way or another, but it's visceral for people who live closer. I mean, even, for a while I dated somebody, an ex of mine, she lived in Montreal, and her family cottage in her youth was in Vermont. Right, it was a couple-hour drive down to Vermont, and a beautiful little cottage on a nice lake, on a really great lake that again crossed the border, and that wasn't like you're going to some foreign country, even though technically you were, right? And now it's a whole different gig.
You see it in people in Toronto who are Buffalo Bills fans. You see it in people in Montreal who are fans of the Boston Red Sox. Like there is like a cultural syncretism where people do try to blend a little when they're closer to the border.
Oh yeah, I mean, people in Windsor, when people talk about South Detroit.
Oh yeah.
In a lot of ways, that's Windsor.
No, it literally is South Detroit, and if you're putting on a Leafs jersey over a Detroit Red Wings jersey in Windsor, yeah, you can do it, but you really should be growing up in Detroit at Windsor thinking that Gordie Howe is the greatest hockey player to ever. That Gordie Howe is the greatest hockey player to ever live. Unfortunately, folks, just as we were recording that final moment in the podcast, there was a power surge in my studio and things got cut off. The good news is we didn't miss much, and we connected with George soon after the power resumed, and we will cut back in there to conclude the episode. Okay, that does it for this week's episode. George, thank you so much for coming on to join the program. We really appreciated having you on here to talk about all of these things, and we'll be interested to see what happens with this election this year.
All right, thanks a lot for having me on, and good luck with this.
Thank you very much. And that's the end of our show this week. I want to thank George Soule for joining the program to share his thoughts. We can all read more of them at georgesoule.substack.com. That is GeorgeSoule.substack.com, where you can read Behind the Backbench, Thoughts from an Old Hack by George Soule. And for those of you at home, thank you so much for listening in for this hour. I hope you have the best of entertainment in the federal election mayhem to come. And for those of you upset I didn't manage to ask a no prize question this week, don't worry, I'm upset too. Thank you, and have a good day. Cheers.